All right, so we're diving deep today into 2 Kings 4, 1-7.
Oh, a classic.
It is the widow, facing that impossible debt. And then there's Elisha, the jar of oil, and then bam, that multiplication miracle.
It's a familiar one for sure, but for pastors especially, it's not just about knowing the story.
It's about how to bring it to life.
Exactly. Week after week, finding those fresh insights, making it connect.
That's exactly what this deep dive is all about.
I mean, it's amazing how much you can get out of this passage, right? I've seen sermons on abundance, on starting small, even on faith in action.
It's so rich. We've got 3 different interpretations here.
Each one with a unique twist, so get ready to take some notes.
It's like a masterclass in sermon prep.
Think of it as a buffet. You don't have to take everything.
But you can sample, get inspired.
Exactly. Find what clicks for you.
All right, first up, we've got FBC Okeechobee. They're tackling this idea of, what are we filling our lives with?
A classic question for sure.
But they use this really cool illustration with mason jars. I thought it was brilliant.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Making abundance tangible. Like, instead of just saying spiritual blessings, you actually show it. Like, are we filling our jars with junk or with stuff that truly nourishes us?
And it wasn't just about possessions either.
Right, it goes deeper.
They talk about time, relationships, even how we think. Are we filling our minds with negativity or truth, hope?
That's so relevant, especially now. I mean, we're bombarded with information, distractions constantly.
And it's easy to feel empty, even if your life looks full from the outside.
Absolutely. It's like that saying, all dressed up with nowhere to go.
And they even tied it back to the widow. She had all these jars, right? Potential for abundance, but empty.
Until she took action, followed Elisha's instructions.
And that's when the jars were filled with something valuable.
And that's the point people often miss. It's not just about passively receiving blessings.
There's action involved, obedience, stepping out in faith.
Even when you don't see the whole picture yet.
Now, for something completely different, Bless the City Church focused on using what we already have.
Oh,
They started with the widow's cry, I have nothing. And they said, we all do that.
yeah. It's so easy to overlook what we do have.
We're focused on what's missing instead of the resources, talents, opportunities right there.
It's like we're staring at the empty jars and forgetting about that small jar of oil.
The seemingly insignificant thing that God can use.
And they shared this amazing story about Pastor Young Gay Cho. Started his ministry with just a few people in a tent.
Unreal.
And now, his church has over 850,000 members.
Wow. That's incredible.
It just shows what can happen when you use what you have and trust God for the rest.
It's not about waiting for the perfect moment or for a ton of resources to appear.
You take that first step, that act of faith, and see what God does.
Okay, get ready. Because Community Church took a much more radical approach.
Oh.
They went all in on immeasurable faith and abundance.
So not just believing God can do something.
They were talking about expecting the impossible, having faith that seems crazy to everyone else. Think about the widow. Elisha tells her to gather all these empty jars, no guarantees.
Right. It would have been easy to say, this is nuts.
But she obeyed, even though it didn't make sense.
That's powerful. The kind of faith that can move mountains.
It's not blindly following orders. It's
Yeah.
trusting God enough to act, even without all the answers.
And for pastors, that's huge, because ministry is full of challenges, unknowns.
You're constantly facing things you don't have the answer to.
Exactly. And it's about that trust, that willingness to step out.
They even brought up the Israelites crossing the Jordan River.
Oh, wow. Stepping into the water before it parted.
Talk about a leap of faith. But that's when the miracle happened.
It makes you think, what are those seemingly impossible things God's calling us to do?
What are our empty jars that we need to start gathering? Trusting that He'll provide the oil, whatever it takes to fill them.
Powerful imagery. Okay, so we've talked inspiration, but let's get practical. We've heard what these pastors did. But how do you, as a pastor, actually use these insights?
Yeah, it's one thing to admire someone else's sermon, right? But making it work for your own people, that's the challenge.
Absolutely. It's all about finding that sweet spot where the ancient text meets the modern heart.
So where do we even begin?
Context. It's key. Before you even think about oil in jars, you've got to ask, what are the empty jars your congregation is dealing with?
What are their struggles?
Exactly. Are they worried about money? Are relationships falling apart? Is there a sense of, spiritual dryness?
Because if you can connect those empty jars to the widow's story,
It becomes real. It's not just an old story. It's their life.
so instead of just preaching about abundance in general, you're tailoring it.
Right. Like if it's financial anxiety, you could talk about the widow's debt, how she was afraid of losing her sons.
That fear of being unable to provide.
And then God's provision wasn't just about money, it was about restoring her dignity, giving her a fresh start.
It's a message of hope, not just wealth, but that feeling of security.
Being able to breathe again, rebuild your life. And don't forget the power of a good story. Remember that anecdote about Pastor Young Cho?
Yeah, the megachurch.
That's what sticks with people. Instead of saying God can multiply your resources, you show them a living example.
It becomes real, makes the impossible seem possible.
Exactly. Like if it happened to him, it could happen to me.
Now, let's go back to that idea of filling our jars with the right things. I loved how visual that was.
Oh yeah, you could really bring that to life.
Imagine you bring actual mason jars to the pulpit. One's filled with a smartphone for distraction,
Oh, I like that.
another with a credit card for materialism, maybe a to-do list for being too busy.
It's a powerful visual.
Then you have another set of jars, right? One with a Bible for God's Word.
A picture of a family for relationships, maybe even a small plant for growth, for the fruits of the Spirit.
It's a stark contrast. What are we choosing to fill our lives with?
What leaves us empty? What nourishes our souls?
That's a sermon I'd want to hear.
Me too. All right, but now let's talk about the elephant in the room.
Immeasurable faith. That can be tough to preach on.
It is. You don't want to fall into those prosperity gospel traps.
The name it and claim it stuff, it can feel so shallow.
The key is to focus on the widow's actions, not just her words.
She didn't just say, I have faith. She did something.
Exactly. She obeyed, even though Elisha's instructions probably seemed crazy.
She trusted and acted.
So instead of telling your congregation to just have more faith, challenge them to think about where they're holding back.
What are they not doing because they're afraid of the outcome?
Ask them, what's your gathering the jars moment? Where is God calling you to step out, even if it doesn't make sense logically?
Because that's where the miracle happens. In that willingness to go beyond your comfort zone.
And it ties back to provision, too. It wasn't just about the widow getting rich.
Her needs were met in a way that completely changed her situation.
That's the hope we need to emphasize. It's not about manipulating God.
It's surrendering to his plan, trusting that he knows what we need.
And that his provision might not look like what we expect, but it will be enough.
It'll be exactly what we need when we need it.
Now, we've been talking about the widow, but don't forget about Elisha.
Oh yeah, he's important.
He's not just a miracle worker. He represents spiritual guidance.
He's the one who points the widow towards God, encourages her to take that leap of faith.
And for pastors, that's a big reminder of our role.
We're kind of like Elisha for our congregations, offering guidance, hope, even when we don't have all the answers.
And just like Elisha, we don't need to have a step-by-step solution for everything. We point people to the source.
The one who can do more than we can even imagine.
Absolutely. So how do we help our congregations be more like the widow? Ready to act, ready to trust, even when it seems illogical?
It's a good question.
I think it starts with changing our focus from what we lack to what we have.
That's a big shift, from scarcity to abundance.
Encourage people to take inventory. What gifts, talents, resources has God already given them?
It might be something small. The ability to listen, to offer a kind word, to share a meal.
We all have something to offer.
And God can use even the smallest thing to do amazing things. You know, we've really dug deep into this passage, but I'm wondering, what if the real miracle wasn't just about the material stuff?
That's interesting. It's easy to focus on the physical, right? The oil, the debt, all those jars.
But the real transformation might be something deeper.
Exactly. I mean, think about the widow. She wasn't just lacking oil. She was lacking hope, facing utter despair, losing her sons, that shame of not being able to provide.
So the oil was almost like a symbol.
Yeah, like a physical representation of God's grace just flooding into her life.
It wasn't just about the money. It was about her dignity, her future, renewing her faith.
And that's something everyone can relate to. We all have those empty jars, those areas of lack that go beyond just the physical stuff.
A broken relationship, maybe? Feeling lost, or that spiritual dryness.
Exactly. So how do we preach on that? How do we help people see that true abundance isn't just about having more money?
It's about experiencing God's grace in every part of your life.
I think it starts with asking the right questions. Instead of focusing on what we lack, what if we asked, what are the empty jars in my life that God might be waiting to fill?
And what's that jar of oil I already have? That seemingly small thing that he could use to do something amazing.
It's about changing our perspective, shifting from scarcity to abundance.
Recognizing that God can work with whatever we have.
even if it seems small or insignificant to us.
And being open to how he provides, too. It might not be what we expect.
Exactly. Maybe it's not a sudden windfall of money, but a feeling of peace in the middle of chaos.
Or strength to get through a tough time. Maybe it's just a change in how we see things, so we can see the good even when things are bad.
It's not always about what we can see or touch. It's about that change that happens inside us.
Becoming more like Christ.
More loving, more compassionate, letting his grace fill those empty places and then overflow into the world around us.
So when you're preparing your sermon on 2 Kings 4, 1-7, remember this. It's more than just oil in jars.
It's about hope, transformation, the incredible abundance of God's grace.
And it can change lives if we let it.
Absolutely. And when you're preaching, don't just tell the story, invite people into it. Ask them to think about their own empty jars, the resources God's already given them.
And to step out in faith, trusting that he'll provide in ways they can't even imagine.
That's the challenge. And the beauty of this passage.
This has been a great deep dive.
It really has. We've gone deep, found some hidden truths.
And hopefully given you some new ideas for your next sermon.
May your preaching be filled with God's wisdom and your hearts overflow with his abundance.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.